Greetings, scholars. I hope everyone is well and doing well. We continue our lessons. Remember when I talked about in microeconomics that on the part 2, the major part, the first question would be always monopoly and or perfect competition with a graph and what have you? Well, a major part of macroeconomics is fiscal policy and monetary policy. All right, so this is very important what we're learning. It's really the heart of the macroeconomic course, stabilizing the economy. Now, that's done in 2 separate, distinct ways. It's very important we understand that. We are currently learning about monetary policy. We have learned about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is done by the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and the President, when they create budgets and decide on taxing and spending. But at the same time, monetarism is done by a separate entity called the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is sort of like the Supreme Court of the economy. It's independent of the government. It does not have to follow partisan politics. It's completely independent. So therefore, they could do what they want. The Federal Reserve governors, there are 13 regional banks throughout the United States. If you look on a dollar bill, you'll see a letter, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And if you look in the fine writing around the dollar, you'll see what Federal Reserve Bank that money was created in. Okay? So the Federal Reserve follows monetary policy. The president appoints the board of governors. There are 13 governors. And he appoints or she appoints the Federal Reserve chairperson. And their job, principally, is to maintain confidence in the nation's banks and maintain the money supply. And through macroeconomic stabilization policies like monetarism, the adjustment of the nation's money supply, they can lessen the natural effects of the business cycle. So it's very important to understand that. The tools of the Federal Reserve are the reserve requirement ratio, the discount rate, and open market operations or bond sales. But to help understand what the Federal Reserve is, we'll take a little look through here. Okay, it was created in 1913 and it is the central bank. It controls the nation's money supply. All right, there are 12 districts. Oops, I said 13, but there are 12. Okay, with those 12 districts, each district, it's organized through what were the needs of society. All right. The Federal Reserve has 7 governors and a chairperson, and their job is to make monetary policy. Monetary policy is separate from fiscal policy. Please remember that, because they do ask that to see if you know the difference. So if they ask like a monetary question, you're not going to say taxing and spending. That's fiscal. Okay? And here you see all the different regional banks. So the letter A would say Boston. The letter B would say New York. C would say Philadelphia, and what have you. Check your dollar. It's interesting. You'll see it right in the writing. It's a little harder with 5, 10s, and 20s because they don't have the little seal that tells you the bank. But they have it in the first letter of the money. I should have brought down a dollar, but I forgot to. Okay. This is just some other interesting information, right? But the idea is it supplies the economy with money. Please remember, an asset is what the bank owns. Okay? A liability is what it owes. Money is actually a liability to the Federal Reserve because then it means it owes people. The money system that we have, what backs up the dollar is not gold and silver. We're off that. What backs up the value of a dollar is essentially the White House, the USS Roosevelt, a tank, a plane, the White House, the Yellowstone National Park. That's what backs up the value of a dollar. So when the Federal Reserve issues money, that's essentially a liability. Okay? But when the Federal Reserve owns like a bond, that becomes an asset. But for general banks, when they make a loan, they own the loan, so that's theirs. But when you deposit money in the bank, now the bank has a liability. They owe you that money. They're going to take that money and loan it out. But they do owe it to you. But the loan that they make is an asset. So these are all functions of the Federal Reserve. It's important that they understand that the Federal Reserve regulates the money supply, and it is the lender of last resort. keeping banks from failing. It also has an enormous regulatory function to make sure that banks operate and operate correctly, not giving out Mr. Weiss a $50 million loan because he's a great economics teacher, at least in his opinion. Okay, they have to have collateral, they have to have a rationale. They can't just give away money freely. Okay, one of the other functions of the Federal Reserve is clearing checks. All right, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but on the bottom of a check, they don't show it here. There are they look like Klingon type numbers. Those numbers are magnetized numbers. And what happens is the Federal Reserve electronically clears checks by taking those numbers. And the whole idea is to keep money flowing, keep money in circulation, and keep it flowing. When the economy is really good, you want to slow it down to keep inflation from happening. When the economy is really bad, you want to speed it up. It's that MV equals PQ. And one of the ways you do it is things like making sure checks clear and move quickly. Because if the Bank of Richmondville had to call every single bank in the nation to get money, it would take weeks to clear checks. All right? So the Federal Reserve's three monetary tools are the discount rate, the reserve requirement ratio, and open market operations, which are also known as bond sales, which are also known as treasury securities, which are also known as treasury bills. Anything like that is bond sales. That happens most frequently is the selling of bonds. It gets very confusing, but remember, when the Federal Reserve sells a bond to the public gives it cash. Now there's less money in circulation. And if there's less money in circulation, the interest rates for it would rise because there's less supply. If there's less supply of money, let's just go back here just real quick. If there's a lower supply of money, interest rates get tighter and they get higher. And then the cost to borrow money is higher and people borrow less. If the money supply moves out, because the Federal Reserve buys bonds, they buy a bond from a bank and they give the bank money. And now the bank takes that money and it circulates it around the economy. So by doing that, the money supply becomes easy and interest rates drop. So that's very important to understand that. High interest rates generally make the economy slow down. And low interest rates can help the economy speed up. And these are the goals of the Federal Reserve. So the key tools that they use, all right, is open market operation or bond sales or treasury sales. These aren't like buying a $50 savings bond. These are usually $10,000 treasury notes or treasury bonds that are sold in groups of millions of dollars worth of them. And the idea is if they raise interest rates on treasury bills, they become attractive to investors. So investors buy those treasury bills, but that takes money out of circulation and it tightens the money supply. If they want to make the bonds unattractive, they lower the interest rates on them and make them very low. Now the investors sell them back to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve takes cash and puts it out into circulation. All right, once again, in order to make bonds attractive, they give high interest rates, 10%. So, it's 10% interest rate. I'm going to buy that bond, but I have to give the Federal Reserve my cash. So that lessens the amount of money in supply and raises interest rates and slows the economy down. Or like now, the interest rates on bonds are going to be like nothing because the Fed wants to keep money going through this economy because there's an economic recession now, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 virus. All right. So the discount rate is another way that the Federal Reserve puts money into circulation. When I need money, I go to a bank. When Dewey, which is the key word of this video, needs money, he goes to the bank. But when the bank needs money, it goes to the Federal Reserve. The most important factor on interest rates is the discount rate. It's the amount of interest that banks are charged to borrow money from the Fed. The lower the interest, the more the bank will borrow and the more the bank will loan out. The higher the interest rate, banks will borrow less, and therefore they will have to charge customers more who will borrow less as well. Okay? So the discount rate is the interest rate that banks need to pay in order to get money from the Federal Reserve. Right now, I think the discount rate is 2.25%, a quarter of a percent. Now, sometimes banks don't want to deal with the red tape of the Federal Reserve. So they do what's called the federal funds rate. I'm a bank. I have a lot of money. I only paid 0.25%. So I'm going to loan it to the Bank of Dewey, which once again is the keyword of the day, which would be 50%. I'm going to charge him a 0.5% more. Instead of a 0.25%, I'm going to charge him 0.5 of 1%. So the federal funds rate is a little bit higher. But the federal funds rate comes with a lot less red tape because it's going from bank to bank instead of Federal Reserve to bank. From Federal Reserve to the bank, when you want to borrow that money, yeah, it comes with a lot of red tape, but it is at a discount, henceforth the discount rate. We already discussed the reserve requirement ratio. Generally speaking, it's anywhere from 8 to 25%. But in practice, it's used very, very infrequently because if a bank's reserve requirement ratio is raised, all of a sudden the bank would have to scramble to get reserves. And in order to scramble to get reserves, it would have to now cut off loans and what have you. But in theory, the idea is when the economy is doing poorly due to a recession and depression, Federal Reserve would lower the discount rate. They would lower the reserve requirement ratio, and they would buy bonds back and put money into the economy. And when the economy is inflationary, they would do the opposite. This is the key to know these 3 steps. If the economy is inflationary and there's high inflation, the reserve requirement ratio, in theory, would go up. The discount rate would go up. And the Fed would sell bonds, okay, taking money out of circulation, okay? By selling bonds, what happens is people get to hold bonds and the Federal Reserve holds their money. That's a key. I would write that down. I'd do it like a flashcard. I'd rewrite it and write it, or watch this video a lot of times. But that's a key because that's always a question on the macro exam throughout the multiple choice and very much so on the part 2. Okay? So that's important. Okay. Once again, we have a fractional reserve system. A lot of you did this with the homework. You did fine with this. Okay, the money doesn't stay there. But the Federal Reserve stabilizes banks and makes currency supply elastic. When I showed you the money market graph, the supply of money is vertical. It's inelastic, meaning it's there whether people want it or not. Okay? The Federal Reserve, if it makes the money supply increase, and we'll learn more about money market graphs soon, the interest rates would drop and the quantity of money demanded would increase. If the Federal Reserve moves in the money supply, interest rates are higher and the quantity demanded of money would be less. Okay? And the idea is the Federal Reserve is supposed to prevent what's called moral hazards. What do I mean by that? Essentially, making sure that banks don't make bad loans that eventually people have to, or the nation would have to bail out. I know in practice, in theory, it sounds great. In practice, it's different. But the idea is to keep banks from making bad investments that would cause confidence to be lost in the nation's banks. The banks are crucial to an economy. They keep money circulating throughout the economy, right? And without them, it becomes a real problem. All right. So the idea here is we do this in class. It was a simulation. Of course, we don't have class. So that's the way the Federal Reserve works. If you have questions or need help, this assignment is a doozy. It's a long one and it's tedious. It really needs time and effort. It needs you to watch this video probably twice. It needs you to go through your reading probably twice and then do the assignment meticulously slow. And feel free to ask me if you have any questions. I hope everyone's well. I hope your family is well. And we'll speak to you soon. Feel free to contact me at any time. Be well.